I am a member of the Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The SAB is a bipartisan group. As a member of the SAB, I get access to many great opportunities by being involved with the Institute. If you are a student and are interested in joining, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. There is a link to a printable program handout in the YouTube event description for this evening's event, which includes the guest biography and the event description. After the event, you will have some time for viewers to ask questions. If you have a question, please type your question in the YouTube chat box on your screen. Please hold all questions until the end of the program. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussions around important and oftentimes difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Questions that are distracting, disrespectful, or attempt to dominate the chat will be deleted and the user will be removed. And now, please join me in welcoming Director of the Dole Institute, Bill Lacey.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Dole Institute. Thanks for that introduction. I really appreciate it. Welcome to the 2020 Edward F. Reilly Lecture. This lecture is made possible by a gift from Mr. Ed Reilly. Ed, I believe you're watching out there, so I hope you enjoyed tonight's program, and we very much appreciate what you have done to create this lecture series at the Dole Institute. Tonight's program, as you heard in that wonderful introduction, we'll have a question and answer session. You can enter your questions in the chat window. Please hold your questions until I ask for them, which will be near the end of our interview with our special guest. As the gentleman said, the Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and difficult topics. So we do ask that you keep that in mind, and we will eliminate distracting, disrespectful, or dominating questions. A copy of our guest book is available for purchase from the KU bookstore. Dead Center is the name of it. It's an outstanding book, and you can see in the description or from our website how to purchase that book and also how you can get a signed book plate from our guest. Our guest tonight is a former three-term congressman who's got an extraordinary background. As a matter of fact, one of the fascinating things I read about him this afternoon is that in his 3 terms of Congress, he returned $1 million of his office expenses to the public treasury, and that speaks very highly. So please join me in welcoming Congressman Jason Altmire. Jason, glad you could join us tonight.
Thank you for having me, and I do want to thank Mr. Reilly. Long and distinguished career both in Kansas and at the national level of public service, made a huge difference in his career, and I'm just so appreciative that he has decided to take on polarization and bipartisanship as his issue in sponsoring these lectures. It's such an important issue, and it's a big problem for the country. So he is making a big difference by his sponsorship, and I appreciate the invitation to be with you tonight.
Yes, and we think that you're an ideal person to address those topics. Let's start, Jason, with some personal info. Can you describe your upbringing and your education and where you're from?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh, and went to high school there. Formative years in the late 70s and 1980s. So paid attention to current events. That was during the Reagan administration. When I was in high school, one of the few people who watched the State of the Union address and things like that. So I always had an interest in public service and politics. Went to school at Florida State, where I was a political science major. And my last class, an interesting story, my last day, right before I was going to come home, and I had applied and been accepted to law school in Pittsburgh. I had a summer job lined up, and I was about to go out the door and start my life. And the professor said to me, hey, Jason, I want to talk to you about an opportunity. There's a political campaign going on here in Tallahassee, where Florida State is. There's a gentleman who's running for Congress for the first time. against the incumbent. He probably won't win. It's an uphill fight, but might be something interesting for you to do. You seem to have an interest in these things. And I explained what I just said to you. Well, I have other plans. I have a job lined up in law school. And she said, well, this is something that you might want to think about. You can do those other things afterwards, but you really, I think, have a calling in this area and you might want to try it. So I decided I would do it, and I put my other plans on hold. I worked on that campaign. His name was Pete Peterson. He was a 26-year military veteran, and he won the election. He brought me up to Washington with him, and I worked on his Capitol Hill staff for 6 years, took on domestic policy issues. Healthcare was a big issue of the day. And I went to school at night, got a master's in health administration, ended up finding my way back to Pittsburgh over time and worked for the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center in a public affairs capacity. And from that position in 2006, I decided I was going to run for Congress. So I left my job actually in the summer of 2005 and campaigned full time for a seat that was held by an incumbent that many people felt was not vulnerable, but was pretty much invincible. She had been in public office for 16 years and had higher aspirations. Everyone assumed she was going to run for either governor or Senate, but took on the race and was successful, served 3 terms in Congress, and was there during the healthcare debate. Given my background in the healthcare industry, that was a good time for me to have been there. And then after leaving office, I went to work for in Florida, in Jacksonville, Florida, where I live now, for the Blue Cross Blue Shield plan of Florida. I left that role after I wrote the book that we're talking about tonight, did a nationwide book tour, and it couldn't be any more topical to what's happening in the country today to talk about bipartisanship. And I think what's most interesting for me, I was rated when I was in office in Congress by the National Journal to have the most centrist voting record of anybody in Congress. After every session, they score you based upon your voting record from 1 to 435 for each member of Congress, 1 being the most liberal, 435 being the most conservative, and I was number 218, which, if you know math, is the dead center, and that's why my book has that title. And it's very frustrating for me to see the lack of moderation and centrism in our political discourse today, not just in our state legislatures and in Congress in Washington, but around the country, on social media, the political cable news. So I like Mr. Reilly, I have a calling in this regard. I really feel obligated to talk about why we have polarization in the country, what the issues were that led us in this direction, and most importantly, some of the solutions. And I know we'll get to all this tonight.
Yes, and I don't want you to take too much time on this question because it's not really related to the topic, but I got such a kick out of it. Tell folks how you met the legendary defensive back Deion Sanders.
I was a walk-on at Florida State as a wide receiver. I was a high school football player and worked on the scout team at Florida State every day in practice against Deion Sanders. And that showed me very quickly that football was not going to be my profession, that he was a lot better than I was. And it turned out he was better than everybody. So I don't feel bad about that. But what an amazing experience to have worked against him. And after having to go through that on a daily basis, running for Congress is child's play. It was easy.
Okay, well, what motivated you to get into politics to begin with? When you were, I guess that professor had a profound impact, but as you thought about making that decision to go on work on that campaign, what were the deciding factors for you in that?
I thought it would be an exciting campaign. It was a challenge. As I said, this was a candidate who was running against an incumbent. So I was intrigued by that. I liked the fact that she had asked me, that she thought it was something I would be good at. And when I took the job on Capitol Hill, I certainly never would have dreamed that I would one day run myself and be elected to Congress myself. as a staff position right out of college was such an exciting time. I caught the last 2 years of the first President Bush, and President Clinton was elected, made healthcare a priority, and that was the issue I was working on. I was appointed to President Clinton's task force on healthcare reform at 25 years old. So really got a taste of politics at a pretty high level early in my career. But I wanted to make healthcare my career. I didn't think I was going to run for office. And then I was a Democrat, we should have said that, and a centrist, but I was a Democrat. And after the 2004 election, I felt like the district in which I lived, which had 146 different towns across the northern suburbs of Pittsburgh and the Ohio-West Virginia border. So it was a district that kind of mixed the blue collar Rust Belt Democrats that you might think of when you think of Pittsburgh, the conservative Democrats, and the affluent communities, the suburbs that were Republican, but they were pro-business Republican, anti-tax pro-business Republicans, and they both kind of trended towards the middle. They didn't want their representatives to be on the extreme. And I felt like we needed more centrists in Congress, the issues that we're talking about today. And I wanted to make that the staple of my campaign. So when I ran, that was my message. If you elect me, I'm not going to be one of these people that walks onto the floor and looks at my leadership and says, how do you want me to vote? I'm going to vote the way I think after reading up on and studying the issues, I should vote in combination with being a representative. And how do my constituents want me to vote? And you make an independent judgment based upon that, and parties should not have anything to do with it. And that's why I ended up in the middle, why I had a centrist voting record.
What did you learn, Jason, from that first campaign, both the primary and the general election?
It was a similar district. The demographics, of course, were different, but it was a district that could go either way, a Republican leaning district, although it was majority Democrat in voters and voter registration. So they were conservative Democrats that would vote Republican if they didn't like the Democrat they were presented with. So I learned a lot about the challenge of representing a district like that, because the congressman that I worked for, as turned out to be prophetic in my career, he was criticized from the two extremes, from the left and the right. And he had said to me, that's how you know you're doing the right thing. If both sides on the extreme feel like you're being too moderate, that's probably the way you want to be judged. And he had a great career, and I learned the difficulty of representing that type of district. And when I moved back to Western Pennsylvania and had a similar circumstance, I had a community affairs role. So I traveled all around the region and I met people, and I could just sense the frustration that existed with the partisanship that they saw in the mid-2000s. We were at war with Iraq and Afghanistan. It was at the height of those wars. Katrina had just happened, and there was just a lot of polarization, and so much like today with some different issues going on. And I just felt like I wanted to send a message that we could succeed both in a campaign and winning an election, but also be an effective legislator if you govern from the center.
When you arrived in Washington as a member of the House, how long did it take you to figure out how polarized politics was at that point?
Immediately, because if you think back to the 2006 election, the students may not remember this, but that was a wave election like we've seen in recent years, where the Republicans had control. President Bush was in office, and the Republicans controlled both the House and the Senate. The Democrats won an overwhelming victory, retook control of the House for the first time in 12 years. And that was driven by independent voters. The polls showed there was an 18-point swing between 2004 and 2006 when I won on how independents voted. And that swing is what drove the change in that wave and the new leadership that was brought in. So there were a lot of conservative, moderate, middle of the road Democrats who came in with that class. And to your question, almost immediately, we were told by our leadership and by Organized labor was a big part of this. Some of the more left-leaning groups, hey, you're not here to do your own thing. Put this idea of bipartisanship to the side. You are here to drive the party agenda, and that's what we expect you to do. And that was an early warning sign for me that this was not going to be easy, that this was something I was going to have to fight against my whole career. And it turned out to be true. But it was clear right from the beginning that the Democrats who had the new control of the Congress were not at all interested in bipartisan solutions.
I'm sure, Jason, knowing your centrist perspective, you probably made some friends on the other side of the aisle. I'm curious, did they get the same speech the first day too?
It's funny, I don't know about the first day, but I do know there was a member of Congress in Western Pennsylvania who was a Republican who had served a little bit longer than me. And he was also a moderate, had a similar district as I did. And we decided we were going to do town hall meetings together, joint meetings where one in his district and one in my district, we would invite all of our constituents. And we would not let it devolve into these town hall meetings that you see today with the shouting and the video cameras and everyone, all the infighting. We wanted to keep it civil and have a discussion on public policy with a Republican and a Democrat there together, showing that we could work together. And we did this. And after the first meeting, my leadership came to me on the Democratic side and said, we don't want you to do this anymore. We know you have a second meeting scheduled. We want you to cancel it because we are going to go after him in the next election. And we want to paint him as a right-wing zealot who's tied in with all the things that we're going to be campaigning against. And you're hurting our ability to characterize him that way by holding these meetings. And I said, well, respectfully, I'm still going to do it. We've agreed to do it. I think it's the right thing to do. And I went and told Tim Murphy was his name. And he said, it's funny that you say that because my leadership told me the exact same thing. They're going to come after you and try to paint you as an acolyte of Nancy Pelosi and a far left liberal. And they said that the message is damaged by us doing these meetings together. So we laughed about that, but I think that's a pretty clear indication of the way things work on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Now, as a congressman, how did you go about balancing your personal views about what was best versus your constituents' views about what they wanted?
I think the best answer to that is I'll tell you how I decided on the health care bill, on the Affordable Care Act. And I cast over 5,000 votes in the 3 terms I was in office. And on each of them, I made this judgment. And on the ACA, I had a healthcare background. So I learned the issue. I formed my own opinion on whether or not I thought that was a good piece of legislation. I thought we could do better. But that's not the whole thing. Your title is representative. And I had learned a lot over the years about the difference between the House and the Senate. I'm a student of history and I'm interested in these things. And if you look at the way the Senate is designed, every state has 2, they have 6-year terms. They have the filibuster and all the ways that you can obstruct legislation from coming forward. And then you compare that to the House, where there's 2-year terms, it's majority vote. If you have one more vote than the other side, you win every time, and there is nothing the minority party can do about it. And the 2-year terms are so you can be responsive to the people, so you can do what they want as your representative. And that's your title, representative. So I had to weigh the difference between my own point of view and public opinion. And you learn public opinion, yes, through polling. People do polls, but there's nothing like traveling around your district and talking to people and hearing what they have to say. And you learn very quickly that just showing up at a town hall meeting where the people who are inclined to go to that type of event tend towards the extreme. They're the people with a strong point of view. It's worth listening to them, but that doesn't necessarily mean your whole district feels that way. So you really have to work hard to learn what your constituents feel. On a major issue like immigration or the Affordable Care Act, you receive literally thousands of phone calls and letters from your district that you have to sort through. So you have those 2 things. You have what does your constituents want you to do? What do you personally feel about this legislation. And then the third element is the bill that you're voting on, how does it impact your district? Because that might be different than how your constituents view it. Is it going to have a positive or negative influence on your district? With regard to the Affordable Care Act, it had several negative implications. I had the most Medicare Advantage recipients in the country in that district that I represented, so seniors on Medicare, and that bill cut by $150 billion Medicare Advantage. So that was something that I had to take into consideration. I had among the least number of uninsured citizens of anyone in any district in the country. I had people who were poor that were on Medicaid. I had that wealthy section of the district who were employed and had health insurance. I had a lot of seniors on Medicare. I didn't have a lot of people who lacked health insurance. So the bill basically took money from my constituents to give to somebody else's constituents. So when you add all of that up, the impact of whatever the legislation is you're voting on your district, the point of view of your constituents and your personal view, you put it all together and you have to make a decision. And for some people, it's really easy. They just do what the party wants them to do, but that's not the way I approached it.
Right. Why do you believe that polarization has increased so dramatically in the last 30 years? I mean, you look at Bob Dole and Ted Kennedy, or Bob Dole and George McGovern, or Bob Dole and Pat Moynihan. They used to work together in the Senate all the time. We don't see that at all. What changed that?
Yeah, those were legends of the Senate. They were giants, and Senator Dole in particular was willing to work with both sides and a pragmatist, both in the majority and in the minority. And those days do appear to be gone, at least for now. And it's not just anecdotally, it's in the data. If you look at the number of times in the House where I served, where the voters cross, where the furthest left Republican crosses over from the furthest right Democrat, there used to be about a third of the House that was in that middle area where the two sides would cross. Now there's no crossover at all, almost never. The two sides vote almost uniformly in partisan blocks every time. And that's really unfortunate for the country. And the reason, there are a lot of issues. Money in politics is a huge issue. Social media, the cable media, access to information, this idea that people only surround themselves with people who think the same way they do. If you look at their Facebook friends or their followers on Twitter, it's all people who have the same opinion as them, so they're not exposed to other points of view. All of these things are very important. Gerrymandering is a big issue, the way we draw districts in the country. The politicians should, rather than the politicians selecting their voters, we should have a system where voters select their representatives. And in gerrymandering, that doesn't happen. But most importantly, and I think the biggest driver of polarization, is our primary system in the country. We have a system in most states where independents are excluded in many states, but in almost every state, the people who show up to vote in primaries are the people who are the furthest extreme, the most ideologically extreme voters. And the Pew Research Center, I think, shows this best in data. They showed that 31% of Americans in a nationwide survey, 31% of Americans identify in a way that you can characterize them as being on the extreme, 15% on one side, 16% on the other. Now, that means 69% of Americans trend more towards the center. They're not on the extreme. But guess what? That 31% contribute to candidates, work on campaigns, and most importantly, vote in primary elections at more than double the rate of everybody else. So they have outsized influence on the outcome of our elections. And the people who show up in primary elections are overwhelmingly tilted towards those people who wake up every day living and breathing politics. Most people are not thinking about that on a daily basis. Now, we're 6 weeks away from a presidential election, a little bit different right now, but generally speaking, people in Kansas are thinking about how are the Jayhawks going to do this year in basketball? What activities do my kids have today in school? and what time do my weekend events start? They're thinking about stuff that's more readily apparent to them. But the people who do live and breathe politics, think about it every day, they show up. They show up at your town hall meetings, they call your office, they contribute to candidates, they knock on doors, and most importantly, they vote in the primary. And if you are a candidate running in that primary, you want to win. So you're going to message, you're going to articulate your message in a way that appeals to the people who decide your fate. That's the people on the extreme. So when you're elected and you get to office, you're going to legislate that way, you're going to speak that way, and you're going to message your priorities that way. And what I found out is you are strongly disincentivized from compromise, from working with the other side, from being bipartisan. If you are labeled as somebody who is willing to have those discussions about finding middle ground, they'll run a primary against you. That compromise is a dirty word in Washington. And that's the problem today. Politicians on both sides are afraid to be bipartisan, to talk to the other side. And that's a big problem because you're going to face the threat of a primary. We lost 8 incumbents this year, 7 of which lost from their extreme on the right or the left because of that very issue in the House of Representatives. And it's only going to get worse. If you look at the most extreme and the most active people who you see on your TV, and depending on your party affiliation, they might irritate you the most. Most of those people got there because they won a primary against somebody else who was more centrist. And the data has shown that people who leave office after losing an election in a primary, they are almost always succeeded by somebody to their extreme. And that's a big problem.
How do the two parties regard polarization? Do they have kind of the same perspective, or do they have very different perspectives?
People who are involved in the political process, the activists and the parties and the elected officials, view polarization as it's the other side's fault. That's what I have found. And, we have a president who operates in a different way of all of our other presidents. The incendiary things that he says, the kind of completely different approach he has to messaging and the way he carries himself in office makes it very difficult, or makes it very easy for Democrats to look at him and say, that guy's the problem. If we just had a different president, polarization would go away. But the issue is, President Trump is not the cause of polarization. President Trump is the outcome of polarization. We are going to continue to have leaders like that, and we see it at lower levels of public office if the people who determine the outcome of elections are the people on the extremes. It's a little bit different at the presidential level. You have higher turnout. There's different issues with the Electoral College. But at the congressional level, especially in the House, absolutely, they view it as it's the other side's fault. So you can talk all day long. I found, in my case, to the Democrats about, here are the issues of polarization. This is what Democrats are doing to feed into that problem. But they don't see it as their problem. They see it as, well, it's the Republicans that are causing it. And it's the same is true on the other side. So until we can come to agreement as a country that both sides are responsible, and when we have an issue with polarization across the political spectrum, the problem will not solve itself.
If you, Jason, thinking about all the ideas that you had in dead center to try to improve polarization, if you could, implement one reform to try to make improvement, what would that be?
It would definitely be changing the way we conduct primaries in this country. I advocate for either top 2 open primaries, which I'll explain, or ranked choice voting. And both of these ideas have some momentum around the country. In a top 2 open primaries, like California, state of Washington, Louisiana has, Nebraska has something similar to this. Every candidate's on the ballot regardless of party affiliation, and every voter, regardless of party affiliation, shows up in that primary. So everyone's on the ballot and all voters can vote, and the top 2, regardless of party, move on to the general election. And what that does is change that dynamic I talked about. If you're a candidate running for office in that environment, in contrast to a closed primary, if you only cater to that narrow extreme base on your far left or your far right, you're going to lose, because independents are voting in this election. The other party is voting in this election. If you don't do something to appeal across the spectrum, you will lose. So research has shown this isn't just rhetoric, this is the outcome. Candidates moderate their views. They work together more often. In California, which used to be extremely far left and not compromising at all, they co-sponsor more bills together. They pass more compromise legislation. The congressional delegation in Washington works together more often than they did before. It makes a huge difference. Ranked choice voting has a similar effect. And what that means is everyone is on the same ballot, same deal, regardless of party affiliation. Let's say there's 2 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and an independent. All 6 are on the ballot. And you rank them from 1 to 6. You have your favorite, put your second favorite all the way down. And then when the votes are tabulated, the person who finishes 6th is knocked out. And that person's second choice, all the second choice votes are reallocated, and then they rerun the numbers. And they do that until somebody gets 50%. And what that means is the person who ends up winning that election more than likely is the one that has the majority support in that district or that state. Maine has it for all of their state elections. Minneapolis and San Francisco and New York now has it in their primary also. So it's got some momentum. It's on the ballot in some states also, like Alaska. So these are ideas that will moderate the voting population, which in turn has the effect of moderating the representatives we're sending to office.
One of the things that we emphasize at the Dole Institute is civic engagement. As a matter of fact, in the summertime, we do conferences for incoming high school seniors on civics, and also civics and history teachers. And I know that's something in your book that one of the many things I agree with in your book about increasing civics education. How would you go about that?
Hugely important. And states have taken different routes in doing this. Some states, or a couple of states, I think it's Arizona and North Dakota, I want to say off the top of my head, have a rule that when you graduate high school, you have to take a civics exam, a current events exam, and you don't get your diploma until you pass. You can take it as many times, but you have to pay attention to current events. Something as simple as that can make a difference. I would advocate for scholarship money for college and things like that. Under the No Child Left Behind law, civics is not incentivized in our public schools. I think we should change that. I can't think of anything more important than learning about current events and civics, being well educated on those issues. And as you know, in my book, I talk a lot about these studies that show how ill-informed people are about current events. Their National Constitution Center, for example, in Philadelphia, did a survey of Americans, and they tested their knowledge of the revolution. And their first question was, do you think you could pass a test of the American Revolution? And 89% of Americans said, yeah, sure, of course. They took the test, 83% failed. And they were pretty simple questions. There was a great study out of the University of Illinois, I talk about this in the book, on welfare reform. And this illustrates the problem where the people who know the least about an issue, they're the most ill-informed, they are the ones who are most certain that they're right and the most unyielding in their point of view. So they took partisans and they asked them questions about their knowledge of welfare and how confident they were that they knew the issues. This was a very difficult test. What is the state income threshold? How many members of a family can be on it? How long in a lifetime can you have various welfare benefits? Very difficult. So only 3% of people who took that test got even half the questions right. But that wasn't the point of the test. The point of the test proved the people who were the most confident in their point of view, the most certain they knew a lot about the issue, they're the ones who scored the worst on the test. And you see that in politics all the time. Moving somebody away from a just completely factually inaccurate opinion is almost impossible, no matter what you say. There was a study that was done where after President Trump's inaugural, there were those two famous paintings of or pictures of the crowd in President Obama's first inaugural and President Trump's first inaugural. So they took a group of partisans and they showed them those pictures. They didn't say what those pictures were. They didn't identify them, but any politically interested person would know what they were. And they said, which one has more people? And the estimate, if you look at the pictures, one of those pictures had 250,000 people. One of them had 1.8 million people. It's pretty clear in looking at those pictures which one had more. The people who were partisan conservative Republicans almost always said that the one with the fewer people had more, because they knew in their mind what the researcher was trying to get at, even though the facts were right there in front of them. It's a big problem in the country, and civics and knowledge of current events in our young people, and continuing that as they get older, paying attention, creating an environment where they can form their own opinions and make up their own minds. It's so important. So I'm glad to hear that you're doing that.
Yeah, you know, one of the things I really enjoyed about the book was that you just don't talk about the problems and describe them. You really worked hard to put some solutions out there. So speak a little bit about gerrymandering and voter suppression and how those issues affect polarization.
I lost my seat in large part because of gerrymandering. Pennsylvania lost a seat after the 2010 census, went from 19 to 18. My seat was eliminated and merged with a neighboring seat. So I definitely went into the writing of the book thinking gerrymandering is a big problem. And it is a problem, but similar to what I said before, it's more an outcome of the problem than the source, because what you find is, ideally, for people who want gerrymandering reform, they would want to see a district drawn exactly 50-50, half Republican, half Democrat. And if you did that in a district, the problem is those candidates from those two parties would still have to win the primary election. And I told you all the problems with that primary election. Even if you draw a fair district, the primary is still almost always going to present to the general election voters candidates from the two extremes. So the real solution to the problem is not necessarily the way you draw the lines, it's how you operate the primaries that determine who our candidates are going to be. And I talked about that. That's a huge problem. The impact of cable news and social media, there's not a lot you can do about that, because people sort themselves into their own point of view. And the reason there is no centrist cable news network or centrist social media outlet that gets any traction is because, as I said, those people are thinking about something else. They're not worried about politics on a daily basis. They're not going to tune in to see what's happening in current events. And a great study that I talk about in the book is they compare the electoral turnout over time, voter turnout. And if you look in the late 1970s, before there was additional channels, cable networks, you just had the 4 channels, the 3 networks and PBS. And you had to sit through Walter Cronkite, John Chancellor, and David Brinkley to get to Wheel of Fortune, or whatever it was you wanted to watch at 7 o'clock. You had to sit through the news at 6:30 to get there. And people were forced to absorb political information. And they show over time that this slowly changes. And what happens today is people who aren't interested in politics can very easily tune it out. You can watch Keeping Up with the Kardashians, or go straight to Wheel of Fortune and go on demand or Netflix and watch a movie and never be exposed to politics at all. And those folks are the ones who sit out the elections, who don't vote. When you hear about we only had 55% turnout in the presidential election, you think, who are these people that don't take seriously this glorious right to cast a vote on who the leader of their country is going to be? That's who they are. And we have to find a way to engage them and get them interested. In Cincinnati, Seattle, and Denver, when they eliminated their daily newspaper, voter participation went down. That's a big problem in the country. So a solution has to be finding a way to get more information to people. And I think we're doing a better job of that. Voter suppression gets into these ballot registration rules and where you put the polls and voter ID. And those are political issues, but I definitely support making it as easy as possible for people to cast a vote. The more people who vote, the less polarized we're going to be and the better candidates we're going to have, regardless of what party ends up winning. People are going to be more accepting of the result if they have had a voice in that outcome. And the last is money in politics. Huge problem. If you could wave a magic wand and somehow take the influence of money away from politics, that would be wonderful, but I'm not naive. You can't do that. The Supreme Court has equated money to free speech. That's not going to change anytime soon. So I don't spend a lot of time thinking about, wouldn't it be great if we could do that? That's not a realistic solution. So we have to operate within the parameters of the current system. And there are ways that you can operate elections that will result in less polarizing candidates and leaders who are willing to compromise and engage in bipartisan discussion.
One of the ironies, I think, of this whole issue, Jason, is that you have these really good proposals that you discuss in Dead Center for Reform, but don't those proposals have to effectively be passed by polarized bodies of Congress or legislatures?
Well, more than polarized, self-interested. Basically, with all of these things, you have to have the people who are benefiting from the current system pass legislation to make their own elections more competitive. And that's very difficult to do. So certainly getting the Congress to look at things like gerrymandering, independent commissions, and reform of the reapportionment process, it's an uphill fight because they're benefiting from the way those districts are drawn now. Many of them had a hand in the way they were drawn to their own satisfaction. Same with campaign fundraising. I found when I was running as a candidate the first time in 2006, I hated the campaign finance laws and the incumbent advantage and what an incredible benefit it is to be the incumbent and have all of this free media and the ability to raise money because people want to have access. And when you're running for the first time, you hate that. But when I was elected, that wasn't so bad. All of a sudden, I was the incumbent and I was the one getting the benefit from that. And I saw the difference. And I was like, how are you ever going to get people to change this process? It's such a huge benefit being in office versus not. So yes, these are people who are very self-interested. And these reforms that I'm talking about, especially the changing the primary system, the ranked choice voting, and the top 2 open primaries in the states that have done it, they've almost always happened through public referendum in states that have that. They don't go through the legislature because politicians are not going to make their elections more competitive. But when the public can jump over that process and have a popular vote just on the issue through a referendum, it passes more often than not.
Okay, I have one final question tonight, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. So if you're listening tonight and you have a question for Jason, please use the chat feature of YouTube to pose it, and we'll be asking him the questions a little bit later. But my final question, Jason, is fairly simple. We obviously at the Dole Institute work with young people, and we're lucky that we have a lot of young people who are interested in bipartisanship and finding common ground. But a lot of students are not interested in that. And a lot of students are also turned off by the polarization in politics. What would you say to the students at KU, but also at other universities around the country and in high schools? What would you say to them about the importance of being involved in politics and trying to make politics better?
First thing I would say is you can make a difference. You can absolutely do anything you want to do in the political process. I was a political science major at a state university, just like them. I sat in those same seats and took the same classes, and over time had a career where I was fortunate enough to win public office. But you can make change and you can make a difference in many different ways. So be idealistic, be thoughtful about the approach that you take and the risks that you take along the way, but absolutely don't be discouraged by what you're seeing, by the polarization around us. I get discouraged today. It's rarely been worse. We had a civil war, that was worse. So some of the things that were said in campaigns in the early 19th century, those were worse. But it's bad, and the only way it's going to get better is if people like your students that you're talking about, young people, decide they want to change it. And they can make change by being active, by being engaged, by being aware of the issues. Don't let somebody tell you where you should be on an issue. Learn about it, make up your own mind. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't do something because you have to wait your turn, or it's not politically possible, or that's not a viable solution. Make it happen. And you're going to experience losses along the way. You're going to experience frustration, but don't let that discourage you. You have to have a mindset that you want to make change. And we need that in this country. And having that fresh new voice from students from KU and other universities around the country, that's what's going to turn the tide in this country. It is not going to be the current cast of characters. It's going to be the next generation who makes the change that turns things around.
Okay, we have very, very good. We have our very first audience question. James Honey asks, what role do you think news sources play in polarizing politics, and what changes need to be made in how people get their political views?
Sometimes I, just for fun, will watch a half hour of MSNBC and then a half hour of Fox. And it is two different worlds. Every issue you hear the complete opposite. They have different sets of facts. They characterize current events in different ways to suit their environment. And those networks on a good night, on a really good night where there's a big story, might have 4 million viewers. Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow, the big shows on those networks might draw 4 million on their best night. We're a nation of 220 million voters. It is not cable news and their 4 million that are driving this polarization. It's the fact that those folks, combined with the social media that I talked about, they have this cognitive bias where they refuse to accept the possibility that their point of view is wrong, or that the other guy or woman on the other team it has anything beneficial to offer at all. They don't want to accept that possibility. Don't be that way. As I said, open your mind. And there are apps today, some of the most popular political apps will help you remove from your list of friends on Facebook or contacts on LinkedIn or Twitter, people who support opposing political candidates. You can say, I don't want anyone who supports President Trump to be in my friend list on my social media, and the app will delete all those people. That's bad because you're not getting different opinions. You're not able to engage in debate. And the fact that social media has become kind of like driving, where you feel like you're anonymous and you're a lot more willing to have gestures and so forth to people that you don't know, and act in a way that you would never act if you were actually with that person in a social setting. Social media has become like that too. You're anonymous. It gets incendiary very quickly. And that group dynamic of being surrounded by people who think exactly like you do, that is a big problem. And in Congress, because of the way the districts are drawn, 380 of the 435 districts are in overwhelmingly partisan districts, solidly red or solidly blue. And they don't hear a different point of view. They hear the same thing when they go around their district. They hear, right on, keep doing what you're doing. And when we get together in Washington and you have a different point of view, they think you're crazy because nobody they ever see thinks like that. So you must be completely out of the mainstream, and you're not. You just represent a different part of the country where people have a different point of view. So there's no solution because we live in a free society. The people who are drawn to those networks are free to watch them. They're going to continue to watch them. It's like watching sports. The referee's call is good or bad based upon whether or not it went against your team. That's how the message is on those political networks. But as students and young people who are going to grow into positions, where you're working on campaigns and have political influence, don't let that be the driving determination of your point of view. Make up your own minds.
Our next question is from Braden Bangalin. Braden asks, what are your thoughts on the national popular vote interstate contract that is proliferating mainly throughout blue states?
Can you tell me more about that? Is that getting away with doing away with the electoral college?
Basically, as I understand it, there are several things circulating. I'm not sure about this one, but there is a proposal out there that if a majority of the states would adopt this, what they would do is they would cast their electoral votes for the popular vote winner.
Yeah. The electoral college is a lot more important in blue states than red states because the last couple of times we've had to use it to determine the winner, the Republicans have won, and the presidents Bush and Trump were not very popular presidents with Democrats. So yes, Democrats would like to do away with that. There are states that have said that they would go with the popular vote winner. We have a constitution. I'm a fan of the Constitution. I love American history. I think there's a lot of things in there that weren't great, and we changed them over time. The public is going to have to decide if the Electoral College is going to be one of those things that we do away with. It is a partisan issue right now. If you look at the United States Senate, for example, and this is the same with states determining their electoral votes, in the year 2040, which is not too far away, certainly in the lifetime, the heart of your lifetimes for the young people on this call, in the year 2040, half of the nation's population will live in 8 states. And the other half of the nation's population will live in 42 states, which means, and the 8 states with the most population generally trend Democrat. And the 42 states, generally speaking, are in the heartland of the country. They generally are redder than the other states. So those red states are going to have 84 senators. The bluer states, where the other half of the population are going to have 16 senators. That's something the country is going to have to think about as the nation goes along. And the Electoral College is sort of the same thing. It's very frustrating to Democrats that states determine the outcome when the popular vote winner has, in the case of last election, 3 million more votes. But that's the way the Constitution works. So I don't support, to the question, states overturning that concept. If somebody wins your state, regardless of their Republican or Democrat, I think you have an obligation as a state to cast those electoral votes towards the winner of your state, because that's the way our process works. We haven't done away with the Electoral College yet. We may not ever do it. So I don't think that's a good idea.
This is kind of a similar question, but Rachel Bonnewell asked, many people believe the majority popular vote should be prioritized higher than electoral votes. What are your thoughts, and what do you think the outcome would be if this was put into our system?
Well, the outcome would be Hillary Clinton would be president right now. Al Gore would have been president 20 years ago. Who knows how history would have looked with 9/11 and the Iraq War and Katrina and all the things that happened. How would history be different if Hillary Clinton had been president the last 4 years and these Supreme Court appointments and COVID and all the rest? We don't know the answer to those questions. But again, we have a system that has the Electoral College. It has presented us with outcomes that are drastically different, as I described, than they otherwise would have been. And it's going to be up to the voters to determine whether they want to have a constitutional amendment, which is what it's going to take. And it's very difficult to do that, to change our current system. I personally like the Electoral College. Again, make up your own minds. I'm one guy, don't listen to me, but I like the fact that people have to, as campaigns, they focus on states and they go out, and when we were able to do that before COVID, and they have these rallies. If you went to a pure popular vote, you would just see them on the coasts talking in the big cities, and it may or may not change the outcomes, but it definitely would change the way campaigns are operated.
Here's a question from George Burdick. He asks, we've had many moments in our history when we've been hyperpartisan, and we are certainly in one now, but what can we do to prevent future hyperpartisan eras?
I'm hopeful that we won't have this continue, and we will be able to look back on it as an era. That would be wonderful. Again, election reform is the biggest part of that. Having a citizenry like yourself, George, and others who want to make a difference and decide for themselves that polarization is not the best thing for the country. I think we are at the height of it right now. I think it's naive to think there's much we can do in the immediate term. We have an election right in front of us. We might have a change in control of government. We're going to have a very contentious Supreme Court battle over the next several weeks. It is not going to be fun to watch, but when that's over and when we have a change in administration, whether it be for now or in 4 years, maybe some of this can happen, but it's not going to happen until we change the way we run elections, and until people decide that it's not a game and it's not watching a sport and rooting against the other team, that we're the team. America is the team. We're all working together. We are one country, and we are tearing ourselves apart. And until we realize that, things are not going to change.
I want to compliment our audience tonight because we're getting some really very good and very thoughtful questions. Here's another one that I find very interesting, and I hadn't really thought about this, but Ethan Sharp asks, what are your thoughts on incentivizing voter participation through tax relief, similar to the Affordable Care Act's tax on those without health insurance?
This is a great question, and you do have that idea. There are countries like Australia where there's a penalty for not voting. They tax you for not voting. Our Constitution doesn't allow that. It doesn't allow you to be penalized for exercising your freedom of choice to not vote, but you can be incentivized for voting. That would be one way to do it. That would be an interesting idea. Another way I've heard is to have a national lottery, and your ticket to the lottery is your voting stub. And if you vote, you're in the lottery. And then they conduct the lottery, and whatever amount of money's in there, a couple $100 million or more, you win the lottery. And that would probably drive up registration from a lot of folks too. But incentivizing is what other countries have done. It is disgraceful. If you look at America's voter turnout in presidential elections and leadership elections, compare that to other countries that have 90–95% voter turnout. And some of them incentivize voting in a way like he's describing. So I think that would be a good idea. Having Election Day be a national holiday would be another one, making it very convenient for people to vote. Mail-in ballots are something you're hearing a lot about now. I mean, these are things in the future. Maybe they're going to look at being able to vote online, and you can do your banking online in a very secure way. Anything we can do to make it easier for people to vote and incentivize them to do so, I think is a good idea.
Okay, well, I think that's all of our audience questions that we've received, Jason. I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been a terrific program. And if you looked at the mission of the Dole Institute, this one is just exactly in conjunction with it, which is one of the reasons we're so appreciative to Mr. Reilly for supporting this fund. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. The name of Jason's book is Dead Center. Again, you can find out how to buy a copy from the KU bookstore on our website or in the description on this YouTube page. Jason, thanks so much again for taking the time to join us tonight.
Thank you very much, and good luck to all the students in your future careers.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the audience, the great questions, and we hope to see you at our next evening program. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for our program this evening. If you are a student and would like to join the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Tomorrow at 4 p.m., we will live stream the first discussion group of the semester with Dole Fellow Colleen McCain-Nelson and her guest speakers, Alan Katz and Kevin Yoder, where they would discuss the 2020 election. You can access this program on the Dole Institute's YouTube channel, just like tonight's program. Refer to doleinstitute.org for up-to-date information on all of our upcoming programs. If you enjoyed tonight's program, consider becoming a friend of the Dole Institute by donating to help make programs like this possible. We hope you enjoyed this evening's program. Thank you and good night.